I don't know how many of you are familiar with Leonard Read's story, I, Pencil, but it's a good essay about the benefits of division of labor in our society. He focuses on the pencil and how it would be horribly inefficient for a single person to make an item as simple as a pencil on his or her own. Although simple, there are many parts that need to be manufactured, and each part requires substantial expertise and machinery. Not a single person alive has all of the knowledge and skill required to make a high-quality pencil. I firmly believe that for many items, he makes a very good point. If you survey all of the items in your own household and ask yourself the question, how many of these things would I have if I was completely divorced from society? I'm sure the answer you will come up with is virtually none of them. After all, even a hand-knit wool blanket would require knitting needles, spun wool, and dye. And the needles would need to be fashioned out of metal or wood, and the wool would have to be shorn off of a sheep that would require tending. Division of labor and our participation in it is truly a marvelous thing. It really does make our efforts much more efficient when we work as a society, each of us doing our own part to create things that would not be possible without cooperative effort. So participation in society confers many, many benefits. But the question needs to be asked, is there a point beyond which the division of labor is harmful? My wife and I answered this question in the affirmative many years ago. We were faced with a choice of whether she would return to her job after having our second child or stay at home as a full-time mom for a few years. We were strongly inclined for her to stay home full-time with the boys, but just the same, we ran the numbers to find out how much we would be giving up if we decided to make that desire a reality. To our surprise, we found out that after netting out the taxes and paying for daycare, we'd actually be worse off financially if she returned to work. That made the decision quite easy. At the same time, it taught us an interesting lesson about some of the true costs of fully participating in our modern-day society. Sometimes it is more efficient to not fully participate. By that, I mean sometimes it makes sense to take some of our hours that could be spent working for someone else as their employee and spend them doing things for yourself that otherwise might need to be hired out to somebody for want of time. Lots of people bust their butts at work and then pay for conveniences because they are either too tired or just don't have the time to do things for themselves. A few examples include buying lots of prepared food, hiring a lawn service, hiring a painter, and as I've said, hiring someone to watch the kids during work hours. The decision and the factors involved will all be different for everyone. But let's look at some of the sources of inefficiency that may swing things in favor of only partially participating in society's division of labor. We'll start by assuming that we have a married couple living in the state of New York. For every dollar our couple spends consuming stuff made by others in our society, they're going to have to work to produce sufficient income. We'll assume for now that our couple doesn't go into debt and also doesn't save very much. Each dollar that they earn from their employer goes into spending in that given year. For each dollar that they earn, there are going to be certain frictional costs. A couple of big ones are federal and state income tax. If our couple doesn't itemize their deductions and always takes the standard deduction, these are the federal and state taxes the married couple can expect to pay. That little tip below $50,000 probably doesn't really exist because there are all kinds of tax credits available to low-income earners. But I'm going to keep things simple and not complicate the analysis by including any of these. Of course, we can't ignore Social Security and Medicare tax. Many tax-savvy people will probably object to the size of the slice that I've included here. Ordinarily, employed people will pay 6.2% of their wages up to a cap of $137,700 in FICA tax and 1.45% of their wages as Medicare tax. The government actually collects twice this amount. The employer pays the other half. But it would be naive to think that the other half is simply a cost that the employers will pay without making other adjustments. I argue that employers pay a lower wage than they otherwise would to compensate for this cost, and thus the employee actually bears the brunt of the full payroll tax. So we can see that the actual payroll tax represents a fairly large frictional cost for earned income. Oh, and let's not forget sales tax. In the average county in New York, the sales tax is 8%. Some might say 8% is not reasonable. One might argue that not all of the things that we buy are subject to sales tax. One of the biggest examples is housing. Yes, it's true that transfer and stamp taxes are much lower than 8%, but I'm not including real estate taxes, mortgage costs, or insurance costs in this analysis. And I'm also not considering special items whose tax is much higher than 8%, such as gasoline, where about a third of that cost is tax. For now, let's just assume an 8% cost drag due to the sales tax on all of the things that are purchased. If it seems too low or too high to you, then you can make some mental adjustments to the figures that I show here and see how the conclusions might change. I'd be wrong not to include the effect of the gross profit margin of the companies that produce the goods that we buy. Let's add 10% to account for their profit. Now we can see how big a chunk that we pay in frictional costs to work as an employee and use the proceeds to purchase items that are made by others. I personally think that the frictional costs are larger than what are shown here. For example, most of the people that I know spend a considerable amount of extra time doing things to prepare for work. For example, my daily commute consumes about an hour a day. So if I were to look at my wage in hourly terms, I would have to add about 10 to 15% frictional drag on my earnings just to account for commute time. Then there is the cost of work clothes that I might otherwise not buy. My transportation cost would be a lot lower if I worked fewer days per week. If I worked 3 days per week instead of 5, it would reduce my gasoline consumption and wear and tear on my car considerably. And I'm not including any of these costs here. I'm also not including intangible costs, such as the time spent away from family, the annoyance of having to wake up to an alarm clock each day, the inflexibility of the work schedule, having to deal with the annoying people who you otherwise wouldn't choose to be around, and the list goes on. These are surely costs, but since they can't be quantified, I'm leaving them out here. So we can see that the burden of frictional costs is really quite large, and probably even larger than what I show here. Let's take these totals and frame them in terms of how much harder our married couple needs to work as a salaried job to overcome the frictional costs. Here's a plot of total spending divided by what's left over after frictional costs are removed as a function of the amount of money spent purchasing things that are made by others. A married couple earning very little still has to work about 50% harder than they otherwise would in order to pay sales tax, payroll taxes, and the profit margins of suppliers. The burden is still fairly large despite the fact that they pay little or no income tax. As total income and the total purchases increase, the burden of frictional costs also increases. At about the $50,000 per year level, our couple will have to work about 70% harder to overcome these costs. It might be a little less because, as I mentioned, there are federal tax credits available to households earning less than $50,000 that I'm not accounting for here for the sake of keeping the analysis simple. Notice that as total spending approaches $130,000 per year, our couple will need to work twice as hard as they otherwise would in order to pay for the impact of the frictional costs, and the burden grows steeper beyond that. And this is probably understating the burden, as I mentioned earlier. This is a point that should be considered very carefully. At some point, the benefits of participating fully in society are offset by the frictional costs. It's at that point when maybe our couple should consider one or both of them working part-time instead of full-time. The time liberated can then be spent being self-sufficient. There are limits, of course. Complete self-sufficiency is a very hard life. You're certainly not going to want to be making your own pencils, for example, but there are many things that a person can do for themselves much more efficiently than if they hired others. Here's an example list. It's certainly not comprehensive, but it should spark some ideas. Minor plumbing and electrical are big ones. Qualified professionals charge big bucks for service calls and repairs, even repairs that are fairly easy for a novice to learn to do. Learning to do minor jobs can save a lot of money. Cooking is another major money saver, and I find it to be quite enjoyable. If you find yourself going out to restaurants often, getting takeout, or even just picking up convenience foods at grocery stores, then I'm sure that you'll find cooking up your favorite dishes from scratch will save you a lot of money. What's more, after developing some proficiency, you'll probably find that you can tailor the food to your tastes and eventually prefer the food that you're making to the food that you can buy in the restaurant. Here's something that most people don't think about. We live in a very affluent society. People buy new and expensive clothing, especially for kids, and then discard it while it's still in very good condition. I can't tell you how much money my wife has saved us when she was a stay-at-home mom, simply by visiting garage sales and consignment shops. The kids were able to get excellent clothing, and it cost us pennies on the dollar. I even got a couple of very nice leather coats for $5 to $10. A little leather polish applied to a couple slightly worn spots, and the coats were like new. Similarly, a lot of people prefer to buy smaller quantities of food at the store because it takes a lot of effort to store leftover food properly. If you're willing to look for sales and buy in bulk, it will save you a lot of money in relation to the time that it takes to split it up and freeze it. Childcare is a huge expense. Remember my story about how childcare for our 2 kids made my wife's choice to stay at home an easy one? Imagine having 2 kids and paying $120 per week each to put them into daycare. If you do the math, that's $1,000 per month. Staying home to tend a couple of young ones is worth $6 per hour after tax. And during the time at home, additional value can be created by doing the garage sailing and cooking that I just mentioned. Doing your own cosmetic items on your house, such as lawn care and painting, can also save quite a bit of money. I'm certainly not willing to pay a few $1,000s for a season of lawn mowing. I also don't like to pay the painter 3 times for painting a room what it would cost me in paint. Ever notice that at the store there are some fresh items that tend to be quite expensive? Tomatoes and herbs are good examples of things that are easy to grow but cost a lot in the store. If you cook for yourself, you'll immediately appreciate what I'm saying. Of course, the bounty tends to show up all in the last month or 2 of the growing season, and so learning how to can and freeze food is a must. Canning and freezing will also allow you to pick up fresh food on the cheap when it's in season locally. It avoids having to buy tomatoes brought in from Mexico during the winter months. If you like your meats to be antibiotic and hormone-free, then hunting is a great way to supply the family. I know a guy up the street who never has to buy a meat in the grocery store because he's really good with a shotgun and has a large chest freezer. Then there's car maintenance. Ever notice how much mechanics charge? Learning to do some simple maintenance items yourself is certainly a high value-add proposition. Most of these things that are things that the average person doesn't do for him or herself. The reason is generally lack of time resulting from working a full-time job, or simply exhaustion resulting from the same. But imagine having an extra 50 weeks an hour available. That extra time can be spent doing most, if not all, of these items, and I'm sure many more that I haven't listed. Division of labor in our society has certainly generated tremendous benefits, but I think we should all maybe step back and examine whether or not it has gone too far. Maybe learning to do more for ourselves will result in a higher quality of life, if only due to the tangible frictional costs associated with full-time employment. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Leonard Read's story.